Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. So find a comfortable spot, adjust your volume, take a nice deep breath in, let it out slowly, and off we go. Tonight we're relaxing with a book tangentially related to one of the most popular works on this podcast. We're reading The Wanderings of a Spiritualist by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, author of The New Revelation, The Vital Message, etc., published in 1921 by Hodder and Stoughton, London. Let's begin. To my wife, this memorial of a journey which her help and presence changed from a duty to a pleasure. Arthur Conan Doyle, July 18th, 1921. The Wanderings of a Spiritualist, Chapter 1. This is an account of the wanderings of a spiritualist, geographical and speculative. Should the reader have no interest in psychic things, if indeed any human being can be so foolish as not to be interested in his own nature and fate, then this is the place to put the book down. It were better also to end the matter now, if you have no patience with a go-as-you-please style of narrative, which founds itself upon the conviction that thought may be as interesting as action, and which is bound by its very nature to be intensely personal. I write a record of what absorbs my mind, which may be very different from that which appeals to yours. But if you are content to come with me upon these terms, then let us start with my apologies in advance for the pages which may bore you, and with my hopes that some may compensate you by pleasure or by profit. I write these lines with a pad upon my knee, heaving upon the long roll of the Indian Ocean, running large and gray under a gray-streaked sky, with the rain-swept hills of Ceylon just one shade grayer, lining the eastern skyline. So under many difficulties it will be carried on, which may explain, if it does not excuse, any slurring of a style which is at its best but plain English. There was one memorable night when I walked forth with my head throbbing and my whole frame quivering from the villa of Mr. Southey at Merthyr. Behind me the brazen glare of Dowless ironworks lit up the sky, and in front twinkled the many lights of the Welsh town. For 2 hours my wife and I had sat within, listening to the whispering voices of the dead, voices which are so full of earnest life and of desperate endeavors to pierce the barrier of our dull senses. They had quivered and wavered around us, giving us pet names, sweet sacred things, the intimate talk of the olden time. Graceful lights, signs of spirit power, had hovered over us in the darkness. It was a different and a wonderful world. Now, with these voices still haunting our memories, we had slipped out into the material world, a world of glaring ironworks and of twinkling cottage windows. As I looked down on it all, I grasped my wife's hand in the darkness, and I cried aloud, "My God, if they only knew, if they could only know." Perhaps in that cry, wrung from my very soul, lay the inception of my voyage to the other side of the world. The wish to serve was strong upon us both. God had given us wonderful signs, and they were surely not for ourselves alone. I had already done the little I might. From the moment that I had understood the overwhelming importance of this subject, and realized how utterly it must change and chasten the whole thought of the world when it is wholeheartedly accepted, I felt it good to work in the matter, and understood that all other work which I had ever done or could ever do was as nothing compared to this. Therefore, from the time that I had finished the history of the great war on which I was engaged, I was ready to turn all my remaining energies of voice or hand to the one great end. At first, I had little of my own to narrate, and my task was simply to expound the spiritual philosophy as worked out by the thoughts and experiences of others, showing folk, so far as I was able, that the superficial and ignorant view taken of it in the ordinary newspapers did not touch the heart of the matter. My own experiences were limited and inconclusive, so that it was the evidence of others which I quoted. But as I went forward, signs were given in profusion to me also, such signs as were far above all error or deception, so that I was able to speak with that more vibrant note which comes not from belief or faith, but from personal experience and knowledge. I had found that the wonderful literature of spiritualism did not reach the people, and that the press was so full of would-be jocosities and shallow difficulties that the public were utterly misled. Only one way was left, which was to speak to the people face to face. This was the task upon which I set forth, and it had led me to nearly every considerable city of Great Britain, from Aberdeen to Torquay. Everywhere I found interest, though it varied from the heavier spirit of the sleepy cathedral towns to the brisk realities of centres of life and work like Glasgow or Wolverhampton. Many a time my halls were packed, and there were as many outside as inside the building. I have no eloquence and make profession of none, but I am audible, and I say no more than I mean and can prove, so that my audiences felt that it was indeed truth, so far as I could see it, which I conveyed. Their earnestness and receptiveness were my great help and reward in my venture. Those who had no knowledge of what my views were assembled often outside my halls, waving banners and distributing tracts, but never once in the course of addressing 150,000 people did I have disturbance in my hall. I tried, while never flinching from truth, to put my views in such a way as to hurt no one's feelings, and although I have had clergymen of many denominations as my chairmen, I have had thanks from them and no remonstrance. My enemies used to follow and address meetings, as they had every right to do, in the same towns. It is curious that the most persistent of these enemies were Jesuits on the one side, and evangelical sects of the Plymouth Brethren type upon the other. I suppose the literal interpretation of the Old Testament was the common bond. However, this is digression, and when the digressions are taken out of this book, there will not be much left. I get back to the fact that the overwhelming effect of the Merthyr seance and of others like it made my wife and myself feel that when we had done what we could in Britain, we must go forth to further fields. Then came the direct invitation from spiritual bodies in Australia. I had spent some never-to-be-forgotten days with Australian troops at the very crisis of the war. My heart was much with them. If my message could indeed bring consolation to bruised hearts and to bewildered minds, and I had boxes full of letters to show that it did, then to whom should I carry it, rather than to those who had fought so splendidly and lost so heavily in the common cause? I was a little weary also after 3 years of incessant controversy, speaking often 5 times a week, and continually endeavoring to uphold the cause in the press. The long voyage presented attractions, even if there was hard work at the end of it. There were difficulties in the way. 3 children, boys of 11 and 9, with a girl of 7, all devotedly attached to their home and their parents, could not easily be left behind. If they came, a maid was also necessary. The pressure upon me of correspondence and interviews would be so great that my old friend and secretary, Major Wood, would also be needed. 7 of us in all, therefore, and a cheque of £1,600 drawn for our return tickets, apart from outfit, before a penny could be entered on the credit side. However, Mr. Carlyle Smith, the best agent in Australia, had taken the matter up, and I felt that we were in good hands. The lectures would be numerous, controversies severe, the weather at its hottest, and my own age over 60. But there are compensating forces, and I was constantly aware of their presence. I may count our adventures as actually beginning from the luncheon which was given us in farewell a week or so before our sailing by the Spiritualists of England. Harry Engholm, most unselfish of men, and a born organizer among our most unorganized crowd, had the matter in hand, so it was bound to be a success. There was sitting room at the Holborn restaurant for 290 people, and it was all taken up 3 weeks before the event. The secretary said that he could have filled the Albert Hall. It was an impressive example of the solidity of the movement, showing itself for the moment round us, but really round the cause. There were peers, doctors, clergymen, officers of both services, and above all those splendid lower middle-class folk, if one talks in our material earth terms, who are the spiritual peers of the nation. Many professional mediums were there also, and I was honored by their presence. For as I said in my remarks, I consider that in these days of doubt and sorrow, a genuine professional medium is the most useful member of the whole community. Alas, how few they are! 4 photographic mediums do I know in all Britain, with about 12 physical phenomena mediums, and as many really reliable clairvoyants. What are these among so many? But there are many amateur mediums of various degrees, and the number tends to increase. Perhaps there will at last be an angel to every church, as in the days of John. I see dimly the time when 2 congregations, the living and those who have passed on, shall move forward together with the medium angel as the bridge between them. It was a wonderful gathering, and I only wish I could think that my own remarks rose to the height of the occasion. However, I did my best and spoke from my heart. I told how the Australian visit had arisen, and I claimed that the message that I would carry was the most important that the mind of man could conceive, implying as it did the practical abolition of death and the reinforcement of our present religious views by the actual experience of those who have made the change from the natural to the spiritual bodies. Speaking of our own experiences, I mentioned that my wife and I had actually spoken face to face, beyond all question or doubt, with 11 friends or relatives who had passed over, their direct voices being in each case audible, and their conversation characteristic and evidential, in some cases marvelously so. Then, with a sudden impulse, I called upon those in the audience who were prepared to swear that they had had a similar experience to stand up and testify. It seemed for a moment as if the whole audience were on their feet. The Times next day said 250 out of 290, and I am prepared to accept that estimate. Men and women of all professions and social ranks. I do not think that I exaggerated when I said that it was the most remarkable demonstration that I had ever seen, and that nothing like it had ever occurred in the city of London. It was vain for those journals who tried to minimize it, to urge that in a Baptist or Unitarian assembly all would have stood up to testify to their own faith. No doubt they would, but this was not a case of faith. It was a case of bearing witness to fact. There were people of all creeds, church, dissent, Unitarian, and ex-materialists. They were testifying to an actual objective experience, as they might have testified to having seen the lions in Trafalgar Square. If such a public agreement of evidence does not establish a fact, then it is indeed impossible, as Professor Chalice remarked long ago, to prove a thing by any human testimony whatever. I confess that I was amazed. When I remember how many years it was before I myself got any final personal proofs, I should have thought that the vast majority of spiritualists were going rather upon the evidence of others than upon their own. And yet, 250 out of 290 had actually joined hands across the border. I had no idea that the direct proof was so widely spread. I have always held that people insist too much upon direct proof. What direct proof have we of most of the great facts of science? We simply take the word of those who have examined. How many of us have, for example, seen the rings of Saturn? We are assured that they are there, and we accept the assurance. Strong telescopes are rare, and so we do not all expect to see the rings with our own eyes. In the same way, strong mediums are rare, and we cannot all expect to experience the higher psychic results. But if the assurance of those who have carefully experimented, of the Barretts, the Hares, the Crooks, the Wallaces, the Lodges, and the Lombrosos is not enough, then it is manifest that we are dealing with this matter on different terms to those which we apply to all the other affairs of science. It would of course be different if there were a school of patient investigators who had gone equally deeply into the matter and come to opposite conclusions. Then we should certainly have to find the path of truth by individual effort, but such a school does not exist. Only the ignorant and inexperienced are in total opposition, and the humblest witness who has really sought the evidence has more weight than they. After the luncheon, my wife made the final preparations, and only ladies can tell what it means to fit out 6 people with tropical and semi-tropical outfits, which will enable them for 8 months to stand inspection in public. I employed the time by running down to Devonshire to give addresses at Exeter and Torquay, with admirable audiences at both. Good Evan Powell had come down to give me a last séance, and I had the joy of a few last words with my arisen son, who blessed me on my mission and assured me that I would indeed bring solace to bruised hearts. The words he uttered were a quotation from my London speech, at which Powell had not been present, nor had the verbatim account of it appeared anywhere at that time. It was one more sign of how closely our words and actions are noted from the other side. Powell was tired, having given a sitting the night before, so the proceedings were short. A few floating lights, my son and my sister's son to me, 1 or 2 greetings to other sitters, and it was over. Whilst in Exeter, I had a discussion with those who would break away from Christianity. They are a strong body within the movement, and how can Christians be surprised at it when they remember that for 70 years they have had nothing but contempt and abuse for the true light-bearers of the world? Is there at the present moment one single bishop or one head of a free church who has the first idea of psychic truths? Dr. Parker had in his day, so too Archdeacons Wilberforce and Colley, Mr. Howes, and a few others. General Booth has also testified to spiritual communion with the dead. But what have spiritualists had, in the main, save misrepresentation and persecution? Hence the movement has admittedly, so far as it is an organized religion, and it has already 360 churches and 1,000 building funds, taken a purely Unitarian turn. This involves no disrespect towards him whom they look upon as the greatest spirit who ever trod the earth, but only a deep desire to communicate direct, without intermediary, with that tremendous center of force, from and to whom all things radiate or return. They are very earnest and good men, these organized religious spiritualists, and for the most part, so far as my experience goes, are converts from materialism, who, having in their materialistic days said very properly that they would believe nothing which could not be proved to them, are ready now with Thomas to be absolutely wholehearted when the proof of survival and spirit communion has actually reached them. There, however, the proof ends, nor will they go further than the proof extends, as otherwise their original principles would be gone. Therefore, they are Unitarians, with a breadth of vision which includes Christ, Krishna, Buddha, and all the other great spirits whom God has sent to direct different lines of spiritual evolution, which correspond to the different needs of the various races of mankind. Our information from the beyond is that this evolution is continued beyond the grave, and very far on, until all details being gradually merged, they become one as children of God. With a deep reverence for Christ, it is undeniable that the organized spiritualist does not accept vicarious atonement nor original sin, and believes that a man reaps as he sows, with no one but himself to pull out the weeds. It seems to me the more virile and manly doctrine, and as to the texts which seem to say otherwise, we cannot deny that the New Testament has been doctored again and again in order to square the record of the Scriptures with the practice of the Church. Professor Nestle, in the preface to a work on theology, I write far from books of reference, remarks that there were actually officials named correctores, who were appointed at the time of the Council of Nicaea for this purpose. And St. Jerome, when he constructed the Vulgate, complains to Pope Damasus that it is practically a new book that he is making, putting any sin arising upon the Pope's head. In the face of such facts, we can only accept the spirit of the New Testament, fortified with common sense, and using such interpretation as brings most spiritual strength to each of us. Personally, I accept the view of the organized spiritual religion, for it removes difficulties which formerly stood between me and the whole Christian system. But I would not say or do anything which would abash those others who are getting real spiritual help from any sort of Christian belief. The gaining of spirituality and widening of the personality are the aims of life, and how it is done is the business of the individual. Every creed has produced its saints, and has to that extent justified its existence. I like the Unitarian position of the main spiritual body, however, because it links the movement up with the other great creeds of the world and makes it more accessible to the Jew, the Mohammedan, or the Buddhist. It is far too big to be confined within the palings of Christianity. To come back then to the discussion at Exeter, what I said then and feel now is that every spiritualist is free to find his own path, and that as a matter of fact his typical path is a Unitarian one, but that this in no way obscures the fact that our greatest leaders, Lodge, Barrett, Ellis Powell, Tweedale, are devoted sons of the Church, that our literature is full of Christian aspiration, and that our greatest prophet, Vale Owen, is a priest of a particularly sacerdotal turn of mind. We are in a transition stage, and have not yet found any common theological position, or any common position at all, save that the dead carry on, that they do not change, that they can under proper physical conditions communicate with us, and that there are many physical signs by which they make their presence known to us. That is our common ground, and all beyond that is matter of individual observation and inference. Therefore, we are not in a position to take on any anti-Christian agitation, for it would be against the conscience of the greater part of our own people. Well, it is clear that if I do not begin my book, I shall finish it before I have begun. So let me end this chapter by saying that in despite of all superstition, we started for Australia in the good ship Naldera, helmed by Captain Llewellyn R.N.R., on Friday, August 13th, 1920. As we carried 2 bishops in addition to our ominous dates, we were foredoomed by every nautical tradition. Our party were my dear splendid wife, who has shared both my evidence and my convictions. She it is who, by breaking up her household, leaving her beloved home, breaking the schooling of her children, and venturing out upon a sea voyage which of all things she hates, has made the real sacrifice for the cause. As to me, I am fond of change and adventure, and heartily agree with President Roosevelt when he said that the grandest sport upon earth is to champion an unpopular cause which you know to be true. With us were Dennis, Malcolm, and Baby, concerning whom I wrote the 3 of them sketches some years ago. In their train was Jakeman, most faithful of maids, and in mine Major Wood, who has been mixed up in my life ever since as young men we played both cricket and football in the same team. Such was the little party who set forth to try and blow that smoldering glow of truth which already existed in Australia into a more lively flame. Chapter 2. We had a favorable journey across the bay, and came without adventure to Gibraltar, that strange crag, Arabic by name, African in type, Spanish by right, and British by might. I trust that my whole record has shown me to be a loyal son of the Empire, and I recognize that we must have a secure line of communications with the East. But if any change could give us Ceuta on the opposite African coast, instead of this outlying corner of proud old Spain, it would be good policy as well as good morality to make the change. I wonder how we should like it if the French held a garrison at Mont Saint-Michel in Cornwall, which would be a very similar situation. Is it worth having a latent enemy who at any time might become an active one? Or is it wiser to hold them to us by the memory of a great voluntary act of justice? They would pay, of course, for all quays, breakwaters, and improvements, which would give us the money to turn Ceuta into a worthy substitute, which could be held without offending the pride of a great nation, as old and proud as ourselves. The whole lesson of this great war is that no nation can do what is unjust with impunity, and that sooner or later one's sin will find one out. How successful seemed all the scheming of Frederick of Prussia, but what of Silesia and of Poland now? Only on justice can you build with a permanent foundation, and there is no justice in our tenure of Gibraltar. We had only an hour ashore, a great joy to the children, and carried away a vague impression of gray-shirted Tommies, swarthy loungers, one long cobblestone street, scarlet blossoms, and a fine governor's house, in which I picture that brave old warrior Smith Dorrien writing a book which will set all the critics talking and the military clubs buzzing a year or two from now. I do not know if he was really forced to fight at Le Cateau, though our sympathies must always go to the man who fights. But I do feel that if he had had his way and straightened the salient of Ypres, there would have been a mighty saving of blood and tears. There were sentimental reasons against it, but I can think of no material ones. Certainly none which were worth all the casualties of the salient. I had only one look at the place, and that by night, but never shall I forget the murderous loop outlined by star shells, nor the horrible noises which rose up from that place of wrath and misery. On August 19th, we were running up the eastern Spanish coast, a most desolate country of high bare cliffs and barren uplands, studded with aged towers which told of pirate raids of old. These Mediterranean shore dwellers must have had a hellish life when the Barbary rover was afloat, and they might be wakened any night by the raider's yell. Truly, if the object of human life was chastening by suffering, then we have given it to each other in full measure. If this were the only life, I do not know how the hypothesis of the goodness of God could be sustained, since our history has been one hardly broken record of recurring miseries, war, famine, and disease from the ice to the equator. I should still be a materialist, as I was of yore, if it were not for the comfort and teaching from beyond, which tells me that this is the worst, far the worst, and that by its standard everything else becomes most gloriously better, so long as we help to make it so. We cannot bluff Providence or short-circuit things to our liking. We got ashore once more at Marseille. I saw converted German merchant ships, with names like Burgomeister Müller in the harbor, and railway trucks with Mainz Koln still marked upon their flanks, part of the captured loot. Germany, that name of terror, how short is the time since we watched you well nigh all-powerful, mighty on land, dangerous on the sea, conquering the world with your commerce and threatening it with your arms. You had everything: numbers, discipline, knowledge, industry, bravery, organization, all in the highest. Such an engine as the world has never seen. And now, Ichabod, Ichabod, your warships lie under the waves, your liners fly the flags of your enemies. Your mother Rhine on either bank hears the bugles of your invaders. What was wanting in you to bring you to such a pass? Was it not spirituality? Had not your churches become as much a department of state as the post office, where every priest and pastor was in state pay, and said that which the state ordained? All other life was at its highest, but spiritual life was dead, and because it was dead, all the rest had taken on evil activities, which could only lead to dissolution and corruption. Had Germany obeyed the moral law, would she not now be great and flourishing, instead of the ruin which we see? Was ever such an object lesson in sin and its consequence played before the world? But let us look to it, for we also have our lesson to learn, and our punishment is surely waiting if we do not learn it. If now, after such years, we sink back into old ruts and do not make an earnest effort for real religion and real active morality, then we cumber the ground, and it is time that we were swept away, for no greater chance of reform can ever come to us. I said during the war, and I can clearly see now, that the way in which the war was fought will prove hardly second to the war itself as a misfortune to the human race. A clean war could end in a clean peace, but how can we ever forget the poison gas, the Zeppelin bombardments of helpless cities, the submarine murders, the scattering of disease germs, and all the other atrocities? No water of oblivion can ever wash her clean. She had one chance, and only one. It was to at once admit it all herself and to set to work purging her national guilt by punishing guilty individuals. Perhaps she may even now save herself and clear the moral atmosphere of the world by doing this, but time passes and the signs are against it. There can be no real peace in the world until voluntary reparation has been made. Forced reparation can only make things worse, for it cannot satisfy us, and it must embitter them. I long for real peace, and should love to see our spiritualist bodies lead the van. But the time is not yet, and it is realities we need, not phrases. Old travelers say that they never remember the Mediterranean so hot. We went down it with a following breeze which just neutralized our own headwind, the result being a quivering tropical heat. With the Red Sea before us, it was no joke to start our trials so soon, and already the children began to wilt. However, Major Wood kept them at work for the forenoons, and discipline still flourished. On the third day out, we were south of Crete, and saw an island lying there, which is surely the same in the lee of which Paul's galley took refuge when Euroclydon was behaving so badly. I had been asked to address the first-class passengers upon psychic religion that evening, and it was strange indeed to speak in those waters, for I knew well that however ill my little pipsqueak might compare with that mighty voice, yet it was still the same battle of the unseen against the material, raging now as it did 2,000 years ago. Some 200 of the passengers with the Bishop of Guangxi turned up, and a better audience one could not wish, though the acoustic properties of the saloon were abominable. However, I got it across, though I was as wet as if I had fallen overboard when I had finished. I was pleased to learn afterwards that among the most keen of my audience were every man and woman on the ship, of the Parsees, Hindus, Japanese, and Mohammedans. "Do you believe it is true?" they were asked next day. "We know that it is true," was the answer, and it came from a lady with a red caste mark like a wafer upon her forehead. So far as I could learn, she spoke for all the Eastern folk. And the others, at least I set them talking and thinking, I heard next morning of a queue of 6 waiting at the barber's, all deep in theological discussion, with the barber himself, razor in hand, joining warmly in. There has never been so much religion talked on a P&O ship since the line was started, said one old traveler. It was all good-humored and could do no harm. Before we had reached Port Said, all my books on the subject were lent out to eager readers, and I was being led aside into remote corners and cross-questioned all day. I have a number of good psychic photographs with me, some of them of my own taking, and all of them guaranteed, and I find these valuable as making folk realize that my words do in truth represent realities. I have the famous fairy photos also, which will appear in England in the Christmas number of the Strand. I feel as if it were a delay-action mine which I had left behind me. I can imagine the cry of fake which will arise, but they will stand investigation. It has, of course, nothing to do with spiritualism proper, but everything which can shake the mind out of narrow material grooves and make it realize that endless worlds surround us, separated only by difference of vibration, must work in the general direction of truth. Difference of vibration. I have been trying lately to get behind mere words and to realize more clearly what this may mean. It is a fascinating and fruitful line of thought. It begins with my electric fan whizzing over my head. As it starts with slow vibration, I see the little propellers. Soon they become a dim mist, and finally I can see them no more. But they are there. At any moment, by slowing the movement, I can bring them back to my vision. Why do I not see it all the time? Because the impression is so fast that my retina has not time to register it. Can we not imagine, then, that some objects may emit the usual light waves, long enough and slow enough to leave a picture, but that other objects may send waves which are short and steep, and therefore make so swift an impression that it is not recorded? That, so far as I can follow it, is what we mean by an object with a higher rate of vibration. It is but a feeling out into the dark, but it is a hypothesis which may serve us to carry on with. Though the clairvoyant seems to be not a person with a better developed physical retina, but rather one who has the power to use that which corresponds with the retina in their own etheric bodies, which are in harmony with etheric waves from outside. When a man can walk round a room and examine the pictures with the back of his head, as Tom Tyrrell has done, it is clear it is not his physical retina which is working. In countless cases, inquirers into magnetic phenomena have caused their subjects to read with various parts of their bodies. It is the other body, the etheric body, the spiritual body of Paul, which lies behind all such phenomena. That body which is loose with all of us in sleep, but only exceptionally in waking hours. Once we fully understand the existence of that deathless etheric body, merged in our own but occasionally detachable, we have mastered many a problem and solved many a ghost story. And with that, I think we'll end this evening's reading from The Wanderings of a Spiritualist by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. I didn't know anything about this book when I started reading it, but it's quite interesting, particularly in the way it reveals how something like a great war or event can impact one person or an entire generation. If you are interested in reading this work for yourself, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. The description also includes links to ways you can support this podcast and keep it going, including becoming a member of our Patreon, where you'll receive exclusive perks, or dropping us a one-time tip via buymeacoffee.com, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. I'm so glad you could join me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.